What are crafty Xilonen's biggest pros and cons? That's what I'm here to tell you today. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So, one thing that hasn't changed since Xilonen's initial release is that she still remains as being an excellent universal support. In a majority of teams, she is able to easily slot in and provide res shred, damage bonus percent, and all around be a very handy slot in. I will say that more recently, she hasn't really been that good in the more new meta teams. However, that's something that I'm going to touch on a little bit more later. However, for the vast majority of characters in this game, they are going to be able to use Xilonen. Even Geo characters are going to be able to use Xilonen. She is just generally a very good addition to basically any account, because something that you know is that she is an S tier character, and when you pull for an S tier character, you're getting a very good, valuable addition to your account on the whole. No matter whether she has a place on your account currently or not, she is going to be good eventually. So no matter what type of player you are, I can fully recommend that you get Xilonen, simply because she is an S tier character and she is very, very good to have on basically any type of account. A better question would be, which type of players shouldn't get Xilonen? And I would say that if you're invested into very specific teams that demand a very specific type of composition, for example, how Skirk teams generally only have Cryos and Hydras in them because of Escoffier's passive, or how the more recent Lunar meta just doesn't really favor the buffs that Xilonen provides, I would say that in that case, fine, she's not really going to be as valuable as a pull for you at the current moment. However, generally speaking, she is able to add a lot of value to your account. If she doesn't have a use case for you right now, she eventually is going to. She is simply a very strong pull on the whole, and you need to look at this as you investing into an S tier character. She is just simply fantastic to have. And I will say that more recently, there is a more plausible reason as to why you would skip her. However, she is still very much a good pull, and even if you don't really have a reason to get her right now, I wouldn't blame you for just picking her up so that you could have her for the future. Because genuinely, she is able to fit into the teams of about 80% of this game's characters. Another thing that I should mention is that she's able to buff Geo Teams, and that's something that characters like Kazuha can't do, and this is mostly only really relevant for Navia in particular because she doesn't play mono Geo Teams, and Navia is still quite a strong DPS. Now, something that I will touch on a little bit later is that Navia does have a viable alternative now. However, generally, Xilonen is still going to be the best in slot for Navia, so if you're really big on that particular lady, well, then Xilonen is going to be a very good pickup for you. And I will say that generally, she is just able to buff Geo damage on the whole, and this can also be useful for something like a Noelle team. If you were, say, hypothetically playing double Hydro Noelle and such. However, for the most part, this is basically mostly going to be a nice thing for Navia. Another thing that I should mention is that she has genuinely strong teams within the meta. Okay, it's great if you're able to work with a vast majority of characters, but what does that mean if you don't really have any staying power in the actual meta itself? Well, she is an absolutely fantastic Moika teammate, and currently, Moika is the best DPS in the game, and is likely to be the best Pyro DPS in the game at the very least for the foreseeable future, as I can't really see Hoyoverse going back and making a new Pyro DPS for a hot freaking minute. So that's another safe reason to pull for Xilonen. She's going to be very good for DPS Moika. Now, another thing that I should point out is that she will be good for other Notland characters. However, she's not really going to do anything for Kinich because she doesn't buff Dendro, and she's also not really going to do much for Veressa because her best teams are Overload teams, and she's not really going to slot into those. But for the rest of the Notland DPSing cast, she's going to be able to do some nice work. Another thing that I should point out is that she has quite a nice C2, and all around, investing more into your Xilonen isn't particularly a bad idea. It's mostly the Hydro characters that are really winning from her C2, so I would say that if you're a really big fan of Settle Down, then her C2 is very much well worth your time, but the other buffs are still very much nice, and all around, it's a very good C2. I will say her C1 doesn't really do much, so if you plan to invest more into your Xilonen, get C2 or just don't go for her constellations, because her C1 only really serves to provide you with interruption resistance, which, while that's not necessarily bad, it's not really gonna be that useful unless you're somebody that has insane skill issue, so all around, not really a C1 that I would personally recommend. And all around, I would say that the pros that existed for Xilonen back then are still prevalent now. She is of course able to heal, which is also a very nice thing, especially if you have Lady Farina in the team, because then she's able to contribute to generating fanfare. However, we now have to discuss her cons, because I would say that she has actually gained some new negative points to her pull value. Now, I will emphasize, she is still an S tier character, even in spite of the current meta, because she still has strong staying power within meta teams, aka Moika teams, and she is still really good for a vast majority of characters. But more recently, Xilonen hasn't really been all that good. For example, she doesn't bode that well with the Moonsign characters. She doesn't do basically anything for Nafer and Lauma, and she also does nothing for Flynn's teams. I mean, I suppose you can force her in Flynn's teams, but she's not really meant to be played there. And I think going forward, she is basically just going to continue to not really do anything for Not Cry characters. So, if you're really heavily invested into Not Cry teams at the minute, I wouldn't actually recommend Xilonen as much as I would to somebody that's a Moika main or just somebody that mains a character that can actually benefit from Xilonen more. There are some characters that seriously benefit from her existence, that are good characters too, but if you're investing into the newer DPSs, I would say that Xilonen does actually end up in a position where you can skip her. Now, does this mean that you should skip her? I would say that it's still reasonable to pick her up simply because she's an S tier character, and she is still very much worth your time. She is going to be useful at some point. And I would say that the second we get another Geo character that hopefully doesn't play in Mono Geo, Xilonen is going to be useful for them instantly. And the minute we get another character that doesn't really have anything to do with Moonsign, they once again are going to be able to benefit from Xilonen, most likely. So, she's definitely going to have value going into the future, and she is always going to be a good character in general. However, if you have a really specific account and you have really specific team comps, I would say that Xilonen does lose some value for you in particular. This doesn't mean that she's always going to be bad, but if you're in a specific situation where you're really carefully investing into your teams in a very planned and calculated way, I would say there's no shame in skipping Xilonen, especially if you're waiting for Columbina to release, who is very likely going to enhance the performance of basically all Moon-related teams. I will say that she is still a very good character in spite of the current meta state. However, it is realistic that perhaps you might want to skip her with how your account is currently being planned out, and that is completely fine. That doesn't mean that you're always going to want to skip her. Maybe you're going to get her on her next rerun, but for now, I can see a situation in which she wouldn't actually provide you with much. Another thing is that she's more replaceable these days, not only because of the current Not Cry team situation, but because, let's take Navia for example. Xilonen was definitively better than basically any other Navia Geo support for ages. Nobody came close. However, now we do have a pair that do in fact come close. They're not best in slot, but they do in fact come close. If you picked up Durin recently, then the Durin Albedo core is honestly not that far off of using Xilonen with Navia. So, with that in mind, if you happen to already have Albedo and you pulled for Durin because he's just generally also an S tier character that they released this patch, well, then you don't actually have as much need to get Xilonen for your Navia in particular, unless you really want to have specifically her best in slot, but it's honestly close enough to the point where I wouldn't even think it would be worth it for you. Unless, of course, that Xilonen would have places on your account elsewhere, but generally, if you're looking at this from a Navia perspective, well, you have other options. And once again, you have other options in terms of meta teams now that don't really require her. So while she is indeed very strong, and she does still have some very definitively powerful meta teams, she isn't necessarily as required, quote-unquote, as she might have been once upon a time. Obviously, there's no such thing as a required character, but even so, there was definitely a time where I felt like there was more pressure to pull for Xilonen than there is right now. And finally, this is something that's just existed since the very beginning of her existence. She doesn't buff Anemo or Dendro teams. Now, I would say this only really applies to people like Nafer and Kanich, but those characters fall under very specific teams. In Kanich's case, you ideally really want to have Emily. However, think about it like this. Durin is another S tier character who is able to fit within Kanich teams, so there's that. And as for strong Anemo DPSs, well, Venti is in fact a good Anemo DPS now. In fact, he is arguably the best Anemo DPS in the game at the minute. And I do believe that Varka is likely to end up being an Anemo DPS. So with that in mind, those are two characters that are in the meta, and I especially expect Varka to be meta down the line, that she's just not going to be able to support. Now, obviously, that doesn't really affect her value right this instant, but Venti does matter because as of now, we know what he's like, we have his buffs, we've seen his performance at this point. And Xilonen isn't able to help there, whereas if you use somebody like Albedo or Durin, characters with the Hex and Circle buffs, he's actually able to benefit from those. So unfortunately, it's once again a case where Xilonen just doesn't really mesh well with the current meta state. I will still defend Xilonen as being a strong, good character. However, I do think that if anything has dragged down her value a bit recently, it's that there are very much realistic situations in which an account wouldn't really benefit from her anymore. It's the same case as our dearest Hydro Archon. Lady Farina is very much an S-tier character, however, it is super realistic that there are going to be accounts that just aren't gonna benefit from her anymore. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can just skip Xilonen if she doesn't do anything for you right now. Don't feel pressured to get her just because she's an S-tier. She is an S-tier, but if she doesn't do anything for you in particular, you can just wait for the next run when the character is going to be more useful to you. That is completely justified. So strong, absolutely. Needed at this instant? Not necessarily. However, I will say, I do think that once this whole moon thing is over with, and we have the moon teams completed, Xilonen is probably going to be more relevant again. Unless they just happen to make a Kazuha 3, and somehow iterate upon Xilonen and make an even stronger character that fulfills the same role as her. We'll just have to wait and see. But for now, she is a great character with lots of reasons to pull for her, but also a decent number of reasons to skip her, depending on how you've handled your account. Hopefully this video is able to tell you Xilonen's biggest pros and cons. This has been Juice, signing out, and Christmas is in a couple of days, and I am very excited by that.